Joining us now is Associate Editor and columnist for RealClearPolitics, A.B. Stoddard. You have a president who is dealing with an unprecedented natural disaster in some ways, his first real test on that front, but then also having to deal with a great nuclear threat of North Korea. This is a test for his presidency, is it not, A.B.?
It is, and I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not he discusses North Korea on the trip or takes questions. I think he really needs to stay focused, probably after the White House put out a statement saying all options are on the table. Stay focused on Texas, and I think that's, it's a very hard balancing act, but I think today really needs to be about the people who are suffering there.
And what about the importance of how he's going fairly early? This is still a developing event in Texas. The rain's still falling, particularly in Houston. Now he's going to be going to kind of southwest of Houston, Corpus Christi area, where the storm first made landfall, or close thereabouts. But how critical is it that he is flying there today rather than waiting until, say, the end of the week?
Well, it's really a double-edged sword. I think that people will criticize him for coming in when there's still so much stress on the system in terms of resources, accessing all the people who need help. As we've seen from the forecasters, just absolutely terrifying news that with the flooding that we've seen in some parts of Texas is not even the worst that will come. So there will be some questioning of why he came early when there's so much work to be done. But at the same time, this is going to be a long, long, long spell of tragedy after the rain recedes. People rebuilding their lives. The president should come several times. He should be on the ground. He should be empathetic and be with people. And so it's likely that he'll be returning several times in the weeks to come. And it's hard to pick a time and a place to sort of come into these scenes, because the president was aware of this. He tweeted over the weekend he didn't want to come in and disturb any recovery rescue efforts, but he's trying to get in there to show that he's thinking of people and doing the best that he can to help that state. Yeah. So it's tricky.
Hi, A.B. This is Michael Starr-Hopkins. We saw Peter King level some shots at Ted Cruz because of his reaction to Sandy. What are you hearing about federal aid and how that package is going to be worked?
Peter King talking about the aid package that was passed for those victims of Sandy, and Ted Cruz not voting for it. And so there's been this political back and forth, if you will.
Yeah, the senator from Texas said that that was laden with pork at the time and is defending his vote. There are long-standing bitter feelings about the Sandy vote. People have not forgotten that. There's a real division between the fiscal conservatives and the Republican conference in the Congress, both in the Senate and the House, and then the other members who stood up and took a tough vote on this disaster relief. And they've been fighting really about it ever since, as sort of a divider between them. This is going to be a really interesting September for President Trump and the Freedom Caucus and senators who are really conservative, fiscal conservatives like Senator Cruz and Senator Mike Lee. They're going to have to push through a government funding bill. The president, as you know, is pushing for the wall. He wants a separate disaster relief funding bill for the victims of the Texas flooding. We're not so sure at this point that the damage can even be measured. So in the weeks to come, members will be assessing just how much money the federal government will be giving, whether or not to have that as a standalone bill, and whether or not to sort of attach it to some must-pass bill like the government funding bill that would spare them a fight. That would probably exclude funding for the wall to keep it less controversial. This is going to involve more fighting between not only Democrats and Republicans who want the funding released immediately, but others who are going to try to hold the line on deficits, and a White House looking for wall funding.
I'll point out, A.B., the funding for Sandy came in two parts. There was almost a $10 billion increase in the borrowing power for flood relief for FEMA. That was first. And then the second part was north of $50 billion package in January of 2013 for Sandy that came without the votes of Texas Republicans. And so it depends on what shape that this takes down in D.C. in terms of how they put, as you were pointing out, how they push this funding.
Well, it's also important to add there is a reauthorization of the federal flood insurance program that expires September 30th that conservatives like Jeb Hensarling of Texas are looking to reform, that critics say will actually result in more expensive policy and less coverage for those who have flood insurance. So that's going to be a big fight that's wrapped into this spending bottom line, of course.
And there's $5.8 billion in borrowing that the flood insurance program can do from the Treasury, and that's all that's left. $25 billion debt. But A.B., I'll point something out. This is why foot dragging in Washington is so frustrating, because again, they only know how to act when it's urgent, rather than dealing with restructuring or right-sizing the flood insurance program months ago, years ago. Then they wait until there's a disaster at hand and they're scrambling.
That's such a good point, Jake. And also the problem right now in the flood insurance debate is that people are saying, oh, no, this tragedy just happened. This is no time to reform the system. We just have to push some money through and keep it, status quo, which is another argument for why things never change, right? If they're not going to change it when nothing's going on. Then a tragedy strikes and they say this is no time to ruffle any feathers. They had so much on their plate for September anyway. It shows the dysfunction of Congress, that something, the unforeseen hits, and then they're really even more paralyzed than we thought they were 2 weeks ago.
A.B., thank you so much for that. A.B. Stoddard covering it all.